So I'm not going to speak about philosophy of physics. It's not my area, and people are much more competent here than me. But I will address, so to speak, the metaphysical background of the philosophy of time with McTaggart and back to Hegel too. And so in my presentation, I will explore a little studied aspect in the philosophy of time, McTaggart's relationship to Hegel. In his book on the McTaggart paradox, which is intended to be a synthesis of the subject, R.D. Insorson barely mentions what he calls himself the Hegelian overlooked prehistory of the paradox. Yet, McTaggart published two books on Hegel before the paper on the unreality of time, 1908, and one book just after this, which is a commentary on Hegel logic. So, yes, it's here. So, studies in the Hegelian dialectics. So, I borrowed it in my library. The original copy, and I will speak about this book today. Studies in Hegelian cosmology, and also a commentary, a complete commentary on Hegel's logic. We know the argument of the paper on the unreality of time. The concept of time implies the A series, which implies a contradiction, therefore the unreality of time. In this paper, McTaggart quotes Hegel 3 times at decisive moments. The first reference is at the beginning of the paper. Hegel would also have defended the thesis of the unreality of time, just like other philosophers before him. So, in philosophy, I quote again, time is treated as unreal by Spinoza, by Kant, by Hegel, and by Schopenhauer. In the philosophy of the present day, the two most important movements are those which look to Hegel and to Mr. Bradley, and both of these schools deny the reality of time. And Bradley says also that time is a contradictory appearance, but I didn't have the time to explore this way. So I focus on McTaggart and Hegel. The second reference is in the middle of the paper about the enigmatic C series. McTaggart believes that neither the A series nor the B series have any realities. It remains only the C series, which is a timeless order, which McTaggart compares to the theory of natural numbers, and also to the Hegelian dialectic, namely the series of logical categories exposed in the science of logic. Again, in the theory of categories in Hegel's dialectic, the series prevents us from putting the absolute ID between being and causality, but it permits us either to go from being through causality to the absolute ID, or from the absolute ID through causality to being. Finally, McTaggart mentions Hegel one last time at the end of his paper, pointing out that his own conception of the unreality of time is closer to Hegel than to Kant. If this view is adopted, the result will so far resemble those reached by Hegel rather than those of Kant. For Hegel, regarded the order of the time series as a reflection, sought a distorted reflection of something in the real nature of the timeless reality, while Kant does not seem to have contemplated the possibility that anything in the nature of the noumenon should correspond to the time order which appears in the phenomenon. McTaggart points out that he supports the thesis of the reality of time for different reasons that the philosopher he mentioned. However, one might wonder whether his reading of Hegel might not help to better understand his proof of the unreality of time, to shed light on its genealogy and context. I would therefore like to address the following questions. What is McTaggart's relationship to Hegel with respect to the notion of contradiction? In what sense does Hegel defend the thesis of the unreality of time according to McTaggart? And finally, I will say a few words about the relevance of McTaggart's interpretation on Hegel about this issue of time. So in his PhD, Studies in the Hegelian Dialectic, McTaggart focused his reading of Hegel on the notion of dialectic. Alors, I'm not sure, but it may be useful to mention here that Hegel's system has 3 parts, so I propose a quick reminder about Hegel. So the first part of the system is science of logic, which is studies of the fundamental categories of thought exposed in a dialectical order, which goes from being to the absolute idea, passing by other categories, nothing, becoming, something, infinity, matter, ground, causality, judgment, and so on. The second part of the system is the philosophy of nature, where Hegel examines the concept used by the natural sciences, like space-time, place, motion, matter, light, sound, earth, and life at the end of this book. The last part of the system is the philosophy of mind, of spirit. There is different translation. The philosophy of the subjective mind with an anthropology and a psychology, the philosophy of the objective spirit, philosophy of law, and there is also in this part philosophy of history, and philosophy of the absolute mind with philosophy of art, philosophy of religion, history of philosophy. So this is the background of McTaggart interpretation of Hegel. But McTaggart is primarily interested in the science of logic. He interprets this work as the presentation of the categories, the fundamental concepts that constitute experience. By the concept of experience, McTaggart refers to the world of object of perception, as in Kant. For him, the consideration, I quote McTaggart, the consideration of pure thought without any reference to experience would be absolutely sterile or rather impossible. This means that for McTaggart, the categories of Hegel logic constitute the experience of perception. They are therefore abstractions of concrete reality. The science of logic is a reconstruction. It's a first interpretation of Hegel's logic by McTaggart. By contrast to Kant, Hegel would have discovered much more than 12 categories. So I tried to count all the categories in Hegel's logic, and there are about 100 categories, so much more than 12. And Hegel would also have shown how the categories are not juxtaposed in a table, but constitute a dialectical order in which thought moves from one category to another by means of a contradiction. At the beginning of his book, McTaggart defines the Hegelian dialectic thus. So it's a long quotation, but it gives the first idea of McTaggart's approach. Hegel's primary object in his dialectic is to establish the existence of a logical connection between the various categories which are involved in the constitution of experience. So I don't read all the quotation, but you see that the notion of contradiction is very important. And the idea is that you have a category, then you discover a contradiction, so you pass over a next category, and so on, to the absolute idea, which is the last category of the science of logic, and which is supposed to be stable without contradiction, and which includes all the series of categories. So we can take a simple and maybe the best known example, which is the beginning of the science of logic, the dialectic of being and nothing. And it's interesting because it will be the logical structure of the Hegelian concept of time. So you have here a quotation from Hegel's Science of Logic. So it's Hegel's style. It's special, I would say. So being pure being without further determination, in its indeterminate immediacy, it is equal only to itself, and also not unequal with respect to another. It has no difference within it, nor any outwardly. It is pure indeterminateness and emptiness. This is nothing, there is nothing to be intuited in it, just as little is anything to be soaked in it, or it is equally only this empty thinking, being, so indeterminate immediate, is in fact nothing, and neither more nor less than nothing. Here is the way McTaggart reconstructs the dialectic of being and nothing. Being is clearly involved in any experience we have of the world. Being is a logical category, as a logical category is opposed to nothing. It is the opposite of nothing. And yet being is revealed to have the same content as nothing because they are both pure indeterminacy. So there is a contradiction since being is opposite and identical to nothing. And in his commentary on Hegel's logic, McTaggart writes, if each of these terms, being and nothing, is now found to be equivalent to the other, a contradiction has arisen. Two terms defined as to be incompatible have turned to be equivalent. A reconciliation must be found for this contradiction, and Hegel finds it in. So reconciliation is a translation of the German Versöhnung. It's Hegelian vocabulary. So Sogt is led to admit a third category, which is a synthesis of the first two, and which makes it possible to resolve or reconcile the contradiction. So it's another quote from Hegel. Pure being and pure nothing are therefore the same. The truth is neither being nor nothing, but rather that being has passed over into nothing and nothing into being, has passed over, not passes over. And the dialectical unity of being and nothing is the category of becoming, which decomposes itself in two moments: the coming to be, which is the passage of nothing into being, and the ceasing to be, the passage of being into nothing. And this will be the logical structure of time for Hegel. So for McTaggart, contradiction is the motor of dialectics. He argues that contrary to a widespread opinion, Hegel values contradiction, but does not deny the principle of contradiction. And that does say, actually, for Hegel, the principle of contradiction is a formulation in a negative form of the principle of identity. So the expression of the principle of identity, I cannot be A and not A, at the same time, is in a negative form. It is called the principle of contradiction. And Hegel gives so much importance to contradiction that he made it a logical category in its own right, in the science of logic. And he has also a weird expression. He says that everything is contradictory in the sense that everything contains contradictions, opposition, but overcome, reconciled. And this is what we can understand with the category of becoming. There is nothing and being, but it's a contradiction, but this contradiction is overcome in the third category. So another quote from Hegel. All things are in themselves contradictory. It is, however, one of the basic prejudices of previous logic and of ordinary thought that contradiction is not as essential as identity. But identity is only the determination of simple immediacy, of inert being, whereas contradiction is the root of all movement and life. It is only insofar as something has contradiction within it that it moves, is possessed of instinct and activity. So I pick up some quotes about contradiction because it was the topic of this conference. So I submit you this kind of reflection. For McTaggart, the idea that all things are contradictory does not mean that Hegel rejects the principle of contradiction. It justifies his position in the following way, and I think he is right. If Hegel did not accept the principle of contradiction, so it would remain at the stage of nothing, both opposite and identical to being. It would not feel the need to go beyond the contradiction. One would never pass to becoming, and there would be no science of logic. So for Hegel, the contradiction leads to everything as long as one gets out of it, And now a quote from McTaggart. The dialectic, however, does not reject the law of contradiction, and unresolved contradiction is for Hegel, as for everyone else, a thing of error. The relation of the thesis and antithesis derives its whole meaning from the synthesis which follows them, and in which a contradiction ceases to exist as such. So, and this is a quote from Hegel: contradiction is not the end of the matter, but cancels itself. So, contradiction is supposed to imply its own overcoming in a new category that reconciles opposition, and this is the reason why contradiction is a motor of dialectics. At this point, it is necessary to distinguish two kinds of contradiction with McTaggart: contradiction with reconciliation and contradiction without reconciliation. Either an higher category can be found that resolves the contradiction, in which case the first category is not rejected, it is integrated into a larger category. The first category, in this case, is, for McTaggart, an incomplete representation of reality. For example, being is not unreal, it is just abstract and must be related to non-being instead of being understood separately as an isolated category. For McTaggart, the categories of logic offer more and more adequate representations of reality according to the dialectical series whose motor is the contradiction. But in some cases, one cannot find an higher category that resolves the contradiction. And in this case, the category is a sign of error. The reality it is supposed to represent does not exist. It is, we can say, a non-reality. It will be the case for the concept of time in the paper 1808 paper. But in the PhD, McTaggart gives the example of the thing in itself from Kant. According to McTaggart, the thing in itself, Ding an sich, is a contradictory concept. On the one hand, the thing in itself is a thing which exists independently of the knowledge faculties of the human being. We know that it is, but we do know what it is. On the other hand, we actually know things about the thing in itself. To say that the thing in itself is a judgment about the thing in itself, which applies precisely the category of being. So for McTaggart, this notion, and it's also the case for Hegel, is an example of a concept which involves a contradiction, so which is unreal. And it's also the case with the concept of time, but I wanted to see if there is a first version of the proof of about the unreality of time in the PhD, and I didn't find first version of this proof, but there is another proof about the unreality of time in this PhD. So I will summarize this first proof, which is in the chapter 5, entitled The Relation of Dialectic to Time. McTaggart tries to explain that the relation between it tries to explain the relation between the succession of the categories in the dialectic and the succession of events in time. He points out that the succession of categories in Hegel's logic is not primarily a temporal succession. So I quote McTaggart: "We pass from one to another because the admission of the first as valid requires logically the admission of the second as valid." So it's a logical series, it's not temporal. And Hegel considers that time is an element of nature, is a concept of the philosophy of nature, so it has nothing to do with logic. So McTaggart is true when he says that. And this is the reason why Hegel writes that being has passed over into nothing and not passes over. It's a reminder that the process of logic is not temporal. So I can give you another quote from Hegel. Accordingly, logic is to be understood as a system of pure reason, as a realm of pure thought. This realm is truth unveiled, truth as it is in and for itself. It is therefore, besides that this content is the exposition of God, it's another name for absolute, in his eternal essence, before the creation of nature and a finite spirit. So it's just a way of saying that logic is not temporal. And for McTaggart, if logic is atemporal, is not temporal, so the ontological status of time in Hegel is problematic, and he gives a kind of first proof of the unreality of time in his PhD. So I summarize very quick. He says, if time exists, it is either finite or infinite. And if time is finite, the world contains, says McTaggart, a first event which is inconsistent. So here is his argument. So first event, like all the others, is an event in time. So we have an infinite regress. And for McTaggart, it doesn't work to say that time is finite. And if time is infinite, this raises two other problems. First, we have no experience of this infinity. And such an infinity would only be an indefinite regression in the past. And in both cases, the thesis of the infinity of time is, says McTaggart, an illegitimate inference from the infinite extensibility of time. So McTaggart concludes that infinite time is impossible. It's an unreal abstraction. So with the idea of time, we have to face with a choice between two impossibilities, says McTaggart. So it's a kind of reduction ad absurdum. So if you say that times exist, then you have this alternative, times is either finite or infinite, but time can be neither finite or infinite, therefore time does not exist. It's a reasoning proposed by McTaggart in his PhD. And at this point, there is not a higher category to reconcile this issue. And McTaggart concludes that the reality is totally intemporal. So it's interesting because we have a kind of first conception of the block universe view. The universe is eternally the same and eternally perfect. The movement is only in our minds. They trace one after another in succession the different categories of the logic, which in reality have no time order, that continually coexist as elements of the absolute idea which transcend and unite them. And McTaggart uses a special metaphor. There is then nothing obviously impossible in the supposition that the whole appearance of succession in our experience is as such unreal, and that reality is one timeless whole in which all that appears successive is really coexistent, as the houses are coexistent, which we see successively from the windows of a train. So for McTaggart, the universe is eternal and ordered according to the categories of logic, which all coexist within the absolute idea, but which appear to human minds in temporal form. We see the universe under the aspect of time, And in this last quotation, we see that McTaggart moves from the thesis that time is not an ultimate reality, so it's not in the logic, to the hypothesis that time is not a reality at all, because it's unreal, he says. But in his PhD, it's only a supposition. In McTaggart's view, this is an eternalist interpretation of Hegel, and it raises an objection. If the universe is eternally and eternally perfect, he says, why do we see it as imperfect? So it's a Leibnizian question, I would say. And his answer is that we perceive the universe sub specie temporis as a succession of events separated from each other. We do not see the whole at once, but successively. Thus, the apparent imperfection of the universe would be due to the fact that we are regarding it sub specie temporis, an aspect which we have seen reason to conclude that Hegel himself did not regard as adequate to reality. If we could only see it sub specie aeternitatis, we should see it in its real perfection. McTaggart gives a Spinozist reading of Hegel, sub specie temporis, sub specie aeternitatis. It's Spinoza philosophy of Spinoza. And in his introduction to the paper on the unreality of time, he precisely puts Hegel and Spinoza at the same level. In philosophy, again, time is treated as unreal by Spinoza, by Kant, by Hegel. So I think that McTaggart developed a Spinozist lecture or interpretation of Hegel, which is possible, but which is also questionable. I now move to the paper on the unreality of time, and with the idea that McTaggart proposed a new proof, a new argument, but with the thesis that time involves precisely a contradiction without reconciliation. So I summarize the well-known argument. The A series, well, you know that is the A series and the B series. Past, present, and future are incompatible determinations, but every event has them all. So the contradiction involved in the concept of time is therefore that the characteristics of the A series are incompatible, but every event has them all. And the problem is that this contradiction has no way out, no possible reconciliation. So it's a contradiction without reconciliation. I'm not going to go into the detail of the argument, but you know that McTaggart argues that attempts to solve the contradiction lead either to a vicious circle, time is explained by time, or to an infinite regress. We have to introduce a second A series, and at each stage we find again the contradiction. For McTaggart, neither the A series nor the B series have any reality. Only the C series remain, which he compares to Hegel's series of logical categories, as we have seen. So I try to understand what McTaggart means with the C series. So I had a look in his book, The Nature of Existence, and we learned that the C series is an intemporal series, a definite order that appears in the deceptive form of the B series. And like the B series, the C series is transitive and asymmetric and transitive on asymmetrical relation, and the temporal relation of succession hides in reality an atemporal relation of inclusion. So it's what I understood with the C series. The terms then which appear as terms of the B series must in reality be terms each of which includes or is included by each of the other. So earlier than, before than, means included in, and later than means inclusive of. And this works very well for Hegel's science of logic, because being is before nothing and becoming, and it is included in both categories. Becoming is after being and nothing, and it includes these two categories of which it is a dialectical unity. So we now understand better the final allusion to Hegel. So I give again the quote in the paper about the unreality of time, and this passage is taken up in The Nature of Existence, the difference between Kant and Hegel. For Kant, what is beyond time is the domain of the noumenal, which contains nothing like time. The noumenon is another name for the unknown thing in itself, for McTaggart. And for Hegel, what is beyond temporal appearances, or behind it, as McTaggart says, is an atemporal logical reality, which can be known by the philosopher, and which is a logical form of succession, a C series which looks like a B series in this sense. So I'm not saying that the C series is reduced to the series of the logical category of the science of logic, but rather that with the logical category in Hegel, we have an example of the C series, and it's perhaps also which gave to McTaggart the idea of this weird or enigmatic C series. So in his PhD, McTaggart asked a fundamental question: how is it that intemporal reality gives itself under the appearance of time? Okay. How can this be done? What reason can be given why the eternal reality should manifest itself in a time process at all? And I don't think he gave good answers at the end of his PhD to this question, and he was himself not happy with his own answers, and it's a pending question in his work. So I'm come to my conclusion. I would say a few words on the concept of time by Hegel. Hegel addresses the issue of time at the beginning of his philosophy of nature, and his lecture on the philosophy of nature, he said that, quotation, time requires, in order to conceive of it, the grasp of the dialectic in its simplest and first form, that is, being, nothing, becoming. And Hegel then gives two complementary definitions of time, which are never quoted by McTaggart, which is not very logical, but McTaggart doesn't look at the philosophy of nature. So time is the being which in that it is not, and in that it is not is. It is intuited becoming. So we have two complementary definitions, and the first one seems to be, at the first sight, a negation of the principle of contradiction, since it posits an identity of being with nothing and of nothing with being. But this contradiction does not imply for Hegel the unreality of time, not at all, because it is a contradiction with reconciliation, in a contradiction that is overcome in a superior category, the concept of becoming. So the second part of the definition is like a reconciliation of the contradiction in the first part. In the science of logic, we have seen that becoming can be broken down into two moments, coming to be and ceasing to be. And in its temporal form, I would say that ceasing to be designates the passage of the present moment into the past, And coming to be designates the passage of the future moment into the present moment. So I'm not sure of the interpretation of this definition because it is also enigmatic, and Hegel doesn't say doesn't give a lot of explanation about that, but the being which in that it is not would be the passage of the present moment into the past, and the being the other movement from nothing to being would be the passage from future to the present. Okay, and this is grasped in the notion of becoming. So this use of the concept of becoming allows Hegel to articulate being and nothing, but also to reject the conception of time as a form or as a receptacle. I give you another quote where Hegel rejects the idea of an empty time. For him, time is necessarily related to becoming, and he has this metaphor which is well known. Time itself is this becoming, arising and passing away. It is the abstraction which has being, the chronos, so it's a play on word, of course, which engenders all and destroys that to which he gives birth. So, and yes, it's my last quotation. And yes, what does Hegel mean with intuitive becoming? He says in one of his lectures, this, being nothing and becoming are soaked, but time is not soaked, and therefore it is intuitive becoming. So I think that the idea is that we do not see time in itself, but we see processes that are temporal, and so we can see time indirectly through the phenomena of nature which are temporal. So intuitive becoming, it is the idea that with time, time is not a logical becoming, it is becoming in nature, becoming which you can perceive even indirectly. But in this case too, it's difficult to be sure what Hegel had in mind. So I just 3 words for my conclusion. For McTaggart, the concept of time contains an irreducible contradiction without reconciliation, that proves the inreality of time. Reality is eternal and manifests itself in the deceptive form of time, but for enigmatic reason, I would say. For Hegel, the concept of time contains a different contradiction that is reconciled in the concept of intuitive becoming. The McTaggart's interpretation is therefore questionable. According to his own criteria, time is real for Hegel, not in the sense that it does not contain a contradiction, but in the sense that the contradiction it contains is supposed to be resolved in the concept of becoming. It is a contradiction with reconciliation. Thank you.
Very much. That was very interesting. Sometimes for questions, so please feel free. And also, if you are students, you are very welcome to ask questions. Mark?
I have remarks more than questions. It has always been very difficult for me to understand McTaggart. Now I'm beginning to understand some points. And I am a physicist working in general relativity, and the message of general relativity is that time doesn't really exist in physics. We have some notions which are more or less alike, like a proper time. The proper time is not time, and in fact, when I say that time doesn't exist in general relativity, this is not with the same meaning that McTaggart, but I have seen some common points. And if we can look at your slide 18, you are distinguishing, or maybe 19, subspecie temporis and subspecie eternitatis. And I think this is more or less what some philosophers and physicists call presentism and eternalism. And in fact, it appears that one aspect of the non-existence of time in general relativity is that presentism, which is which corresponds more or less to what is written here, subspecie temporis, is not compatible with the view of space-time in general relativity. So I see here some common point between the McTaggart position and general relativity. And my second point is that if I understand what McTaggart means by the series A, it shows some analogies with a position which is the position of Barbour in physics. And I have never entirely understood this position, but what Barbour says is that there is a collection of possible situation of the world, which is more or less like the series A of McTaggart, and is your slide number 21. Yes, 21.
It's a C-series. Here you have the series A.
Yes, and what says Barbour is that time doesn't really exist, but some of the configurations of the world include what is called time capsules. And he says that time capsule is something in a configuration which makes some relation with another configuration. And this is the set of all these relations between one configuration and the other, which makes the appearance of time. But this relation is made in our mind, not in the physical world. So I see also some analogies with the Barbour position, I will say a word in my talk, and the position of McTaggart. I am happy because this is the first time I can see a relation between the McTaggart positions and the positions of the whole notion of time in physics. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. But as far as I know, Barbour position is different from the block universe view. So
yes.
It's
so very particular.
Yeah.
Very difficult to understand for a standard physicist, I think.
Mm. Thank you.
I'm going to say that we can also use a finger system. So if you have a comment on the question, you can raise a finger instead of a hand. So I will help myself with a finger. Sorry for that. I think there is an interesting distinction between two different views. One would be the view of Barbour, one would be a metaphysics, that would be a natural interpretation of Barbour's approach, which I would call the T theory instead of the T theory, because there is a question about whether there is a dimension, a temporal dimension, or an ersatz of temporal dimension. I think for Barbour's view, the idea is more that you remove the temporal dimension from your ontology, from what there is in the world, but what you put instead is a kind of model, what philosophers would call the modal space. So you are realist about all the possibilities, that are some kind of instantaneous possibilities, and you use this kind of modal dimension to simulate the temporal dimension. A bit like in Leibniz, for instance, you have the monads, no causal connections, but the adjustment in the mind of God simulates the idea of a causally organized world. But for McTaggart, I don't understand well what it means exactly to have D series, but it seems that the C series are still associated with a kind of dimension that look like space. All these those discussions about inclusion make it a bit difficult to compare with space.
Yeah, so what is sure is that the C series is not temporal succession, it's inclusion, but I try to look further in the nature of existence, and it's very complicated to understand because McTaggart is a strong idealism, though the C series is a series of perception of reality which are misperceptions because they are temporal. And so it's very idealistic, and but what is sure is this distinction between seeing the words sub specie temporis, which is a sort of psychological phenomena, and the reality itself with C series, and it speaks also about D series, but I didn't catch the distinction, but this reality which exists sub specie aeternitatis, you cannot perceive it, but you can conceive of it, and it's totally intemporal. So for me, it's a kind of also Spinozist thought, and applied to Hegel, and it's a first formulation also of the block universe view, because it's there are also common points, and in another paper on time and eternity, he says that time is like an optical illusion or a tinted glass through which we see the temporal reality. My worry with this is that for me is not a good interpretation of Hegel, because for Hegel there is logic which is eternal, there is nature and there is spirit, and you can reduce the two other parts of the system to the first one, so logic. So for Hegel there is a nature with space and time, there is a second level which is human spirit and so on. So his interpretation of Hegel is interesting but very questionable. For me, Hegel is a philosopher of time and of history, so it's, I would say, a very fruitful countersense about Hegel, McTaggart.
Thank you very much for that. I have a really quick question, because maybe I misheard, but I thought I heard you say a couple of times that McTaggart's was the first block universe view. Did I hear that right?
Yes, I raised the question, yes. So first, I mean a first version, because maybe you have some other philosophers.
Yeah,
Okay.
I was thinking
Yeah.
of all the other British agents.
Yeah.
Yeah. With the, so, you think that the C series is really close to how McTaggart understands Hegel. I've always thought of the C series as being really close to how McTaggart understands Leibniz.
Yeah.
The idea that it's a well-founded illusion. I don't think this comes out very well in the 1908 paper, but I think it comes out really clearly in the 1927 Nature Existence.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering what you thought about that. Like, to me, it just reads like Leibniz. That, you know, we have all these individual monads, it's not time at the monad level, that the way that they interact together creates this well-founded illusion of time. There may well be lots of Hegelian flavor that I'm just missing.
Yeah, okay, I agree with you that I try to understand the paper on the unreality of time with what McTaggart wrote before. So I focused on Hegel. But if you look after the paper in the nature of existence, you're right that Leibniz is very important. And this idea of inclusion of the C series, you're right, it's very close to the idea of the monad, and the fact that so predicate are in the subject, and it's a kind of development of the monad, and it's true. But I would say that even if you take this Leibniz angle, you still can claim that time is real, because for Leibniz, time is real. It's a succession of events. It's an order of succession, and you know, I mean, it's difficult to say that for Leibniz time is unreal. So for Hegel and for Leibniz, you have a certain conception of time, and so the core of McTaggart theory, the unity of time, is questionable for both sides, Hegel of Leibniz. But you're right, C series is very close to Leibniz, and it's possible also that Hegel discussed Leibniz in the science of logic, so there is also a connection between Hegel, Leibniz, and McTaggart, because Hegel, Leibniz was very important for Hegel too. Yes.
Right, Sam?
I'm curious about this distinction between two kinds of contradiction and how to think about it. So the distinction was between contradictions that can be reconciled and contradictions that can't.
Yeah.
Should we think of the contradictions that can be reconciled as not genuine contradictions, or are they genuine sort of metaphysical contradictions in some sense, like being really is contradictory, but that somehow there's a process which undoes the contradiction?
I think that I made this distinction to understand how McTaggart uses contradiction. So when he studies Hegel, he focuses on this notion of contradiction, which is generating a process of thought. So there is clearly you have two categories in contradiction, and then a third one. So you have a process, and the first contradiction is overcome, okay? But I wonder what he could say if there is no reconciliation. And in this case, you have this situation of a concept with a contradiction. And if you have no solution, no reconciliation, I would say that the concept is, if it is contradictory, it generates nothing. It's I would say, it's not a thought, and there is no. It represents no reality, and you have to reject it or to use this differently, because with time, McTaggart doesn't reject totally the concept of time. He says that it's a misperception or a psychological illusion, because he has to do something with this concept, but it's not a part of reality. So it's the meaning of my distinction, and I gave the other example of thing in itself, but I think that this distinction is interesting not only for McTaggart, but it works. For instance, Kant, in the Critique of Pure Reason, gave a table of the nothing. There is 4 kinds of nothingness, and one of them is a sort of logical nothingness, is when a concept is contradictory. And then Kant says that the concept is impossible, and there is nothing the concept refers to, and it's an example of nothingness. And so you can use the contradiction in this way. So it was just his point between these two kinds of contradictions.
Fabrice, on this question, or perhaps again if you have time.
Okay, thanks. So when I discussed the McTaggart's paper with my students, I gave them a story about what the C series is, so I'd like to know what I say about it is correct or not. So the A series, as we can see on the slides, is structured by the properties of being past, present, and future.
Yeah.
B series is structured by the earlier-later relation, and what I tell to my students is that the C series is structured by a three-place relation of being between.
Yeah.
X is between Y and Z.
Yeah.
And it strikes me as fitting well with the examples that McTaggart gives in the paper. But this is something that I never saw, anywhere in print. So is the idea correct, close to being correct?
Yeah, so the idea is that with C-series you have the between relationship. It's interesting because it works for all the examples McTaggart gives. I mean, the series of the categories in the science of logic, the natural numbers, and also I think he gave the example of the member of parliament, and also alphabetical order and so on. But I'm a little worried with this between relationship because it's very special. It's a special one. So you move from time to space. And so I wanted to learn more about this C-series in the nature of existence. And in this book, you have this idea, Leibnizian idea of inclusion, which I found more conceptual. And so it's the solution McTaggart gave to this notion of C-series. And with between, you don't have this notion of inclusion. So it doesn't fit. On the other hand, it's clear that it fits with the example of McTaggart.
And the notion of inclusion appears in which writing?
It's the nature of
existence.
Yes, so nature of existence is in section 566. But there is a whole chapter on the C-series, and also on what are the terms of the C-series. But it's still, for me, a little unclear because it's very metaphysical. But this notion of inclusion, it works for natural numbers, it works for Hegel. But so it's, and I don't remember that McTaggart mentioned this notion of between, but it was my first interpretation, yes. But after reading The Nature of Existence, I saw that it's more complicated.
All right, thank you very much.